Wonderful, so wonderful is your unfailing love. Your cross has spoken mercy over me, over me. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no heart could fully know how glorious, how beautiful you are. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Powerful, so powerful, your glory fills the skies. Your mighty works displayed for all to see, all to see. The beauty of your majesty awakes my heart to sing. How marvelous, how wonderful you are. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. You opened my eyes to your wonders anew. You captured my heart with its love. 'Cause nothing on earth is as beautiful as you. You opened my eyes to your wonders anew. You captured my heart with this love. 'Cause nothing on earth is as beautiful as you. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Faithful love flowing down from the thorn-covered crown makes me whole, saves my soul, washes whiter than snow. Faithful love calms each fear, reaches down, dries each tear, holds my hand when I can't stand on my own. Faithful love from above came to earth to show the Father's love. And I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face, and Jesus is his name. Faithful love is a friend just when hope seems to end. Welcome face, sweet embrace, tender touch filled with grace. Faithful love, endless power, living flame, spirit's fire, burning bright in the night, guiding my way. Faithful love from above came to earth to show the Father's love. And I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face.
Welcome back, everyone, as we continue making our way through the book of Psalms. Today, we come to Psalm 40, 40, a Psalm of David, as most of them tend to be. It's explicitly mentioned there in the superscription. And as I often do, I prefer to kind of start with and really focus on some of the things that make the given psalm different or unique. Because as we've pointed out many times before, oftentimes with the psalms, you tend to get very, very similar types of thoughts, similar types of language. You know, often you have the psalmist in a time of trouble or turmoil, beset by enemies, and he's crying out to the Lord for help, for salvation, and they often tend to seem somewhat formulaic and very similar. So it helps me personally, I hope it does you as well, to kind of note, what's different about the psalm, what makes it stand out, what makes it unique. And with Psalm 40, there are two things that are somewhat unique, or I should say at least two. I suppose you may, as we're working our way through it, something may kind of jump out at you that you recognize as being a bit different, a bit unique, that I haven't noticed, but at least two. One of them is somewhat trivial, really, and that is that the last five verses, so 13 through 17, are actually Psalm 70, 70, not 17. So the last five verses are Psalm 70. So if you go ahead, you skip forward and look at Psalm 70, compare the two, you'll see that Psalm 70 is Psalm 40 verses 13 through 17. It's repeated, almost verbatim, if not verbatim. So that's somewhat interesting, somewhat different. You recall we had seen a psalm, I forget off the top of my head which one, but a while back. One that we've come to that is a chapter from 2 Samuel, right? So close to the same text in that case. So that's one interesting thing about Psalm 40. The other thing that's somewhat unique or special about this psalm as compared to some of the others is it's another of those psalms that has messianic import, because it is alluded to in the New Testament in a prophetic sense. It's quoted. This time in Hebrews. So we'll note that in particular as we make our way through. Otherwise, I'm of the opinion that it's a rather typical psalm in terms of the types of thoughts that you find here. As is often the case, there's clearly some kind of a troublesome situation here. You have the psalmist mentioning those ever-present enemies and a need to be delivered. We have a little bit of that imprecatory type of flavor that we've spoken about before, where he's calling for God's vengeance against his enemies. That's towards the end. But otherwise, it's similar to thoughts and verbiage that we've seen before. So we can break this down. Probably a number of ways to break this down, but it happens to break down rather handily into three sections. In verses 1 through 10, we find a song of praise. Verses 11 through 16, we find a complaint on the psalmist's part. Again, having to do with trouble besetting him and the need that he has for that to be dealt with. And then verse 17, we have a final prayer and an expression of faith. Okay, so we'll go through, make maybe a couple of observations as we go through, and then circle back, because the main thing I want to touch upon is that allusion from Hebrews. So it begins, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined unto me and heard my cry. This idea of waiting upon the Lord, you might note Isaiah 40 verse 31. Those that wait upon the Lord will have their strength renewed, as Isaiah notes. So similar thought here, the idea of waiting patiently for the Lord. He may not always answer or incline himself toward you immediately, maybe not necessarily in the exact moment you want it to happen, but if you wait patiently, it certainly will come. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock and established my goings. An interesting thing is, so I put a note in my own margin here, a cross-reference to Matthew 7, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, 24 to 27. That, of course, is where Jesus is comparing and contrasting two individuals, one who built his house upon the rock, the other who built his house upon the sand. The house built upon the rock stood firm, the house built upon the sand washed away. And you have very similar thought here in Psalm 40, verse 2, right? He brought me out of a horrible pit, out of miry clay, which is like the sand, right? So I think of something like quicksand or this, something that certainly isn't going to support any kind of a structure, something if you try to stand on it, you're not in a very good place. And he set my feet upon a rock. Again, that firm foundation, like we have mentioned in Matthew 7, and established my goings. So perhaps, the question might be posed. You're reading through Matthew 7, the Sermon on the Mount, and you think to yourself, well, for better or for worse, I seem to have built my house in proverbial sand. What do I do about that? I wish I had built it on the rock, but here I am. I've been foolishly going along, doing things my own fleshly way, and I've constructed a house. Here shall trust in the Lord. So this song is going to be broadcast. Blessed is the man that maketh the Lord his trust, and respecteth not the proud, nor such as turn aside to lies. And that verse 4 is maybe a good one in general for us to keep in mind and practice today. I was just noting a news story earlier this morning. A lot of businesses today, a lot of companies are, I don't understand why fully, but they're casting their proverbial lot with a lot of modern ideologies that are antithetical to God's will, to Christian living, even in many cases to outright common sense. And they are now suffering a heavy price as more and more people become aware of it and are choosing to spend their dollars elsewhere. But we live in a world where those who are perhaps influential, more powerful, certainly politicians, folks in the media who have influence over what others think, professors, educators, many of them are caught up in a kind of an ideology and worldview today that, again, is antithetical to godliness, and where, especially if you're a younger person coming along and you're trying to figure out how you should live your life, who you should follow after, who you should associate yourself with. Who is it going to be? Blessed is the man that maketh the Lord his trust, respecteth not the proud, nor such as turn aside to lies. There's a choice to be made. And again, today that choice is perhaps much more stark and impactful than perhaps it has been in years past. But this principle still stands. Put your trust with the Lord, not the proud, and not those who turn aside after lies. Verse 5, Many, O Lord my God, are thy wonderful works which thou hast done, and thy thoughts which are to us where they cannot be reckoned up in order before thee. If I would declare and speak of them, they are more than can be numbered. Now you might note Job 38, right, in which God enumerates some of those wonderful works to Job and asks him repeatedly, Job, were you there when? And he mentions many of the very types of things that the psalmist alludes to here in verse 5. So Job 38, a good thought alongside that one. Man cannot do such works, and of course there in Job he's talking about works involving creation and the way that the universe and the natural world work. Man certainly didn't do it. Oftentimes man doesn't understand it. So Job 38. Now here we go. Verses 6 and 7, 6, 7, and 8, I suppose. These are the verses that we find in Hebrews. And we'll come back to that more specifically in a moment. So we'll go through and then circle back. It says, Sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Mine ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. And just with that one thought, you might note alongside that a couple of verses. Micah 5, 6 through 8, Isaiah 1, 11 and 12, and also one that we're going to be coming up upon soon in our Bible class, 1 Samuel 15, 22, with Saul and the Amalekites. All of those other passages kind of drive at the same idea here in Psalm 40, verse 6. It is not to say that sacrifice just doesn't matter, but rather it's that God requires genuineness of heart. If you're just going through the motions, making the sacrifice, to obey is better than sacrifice, right? That's the idea that we find in Samuel and also in Micah and Isaiah. God wants those who are truly faithful, who mean it, whose heart is in the sacrifice, not merely an empty, vain ritual. Then said I, Lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me. I delight to do thy will, O my God, yea, thy law is within my heart. I have preached righteousness in the great congregation. Lo, I have not refrained my lips. O Lord, thou knowest. I have not hid thy righteousness within my heart. I have declared thy faithfulness and thy salvation. I have not concealed thy loving kindness and thy truth from the great congregation. Okay, so in other words, you say, look, and we've seen a similar thought prior to this in the Psalms. The idea of look at my record, right? Look at what I've done. He has confessed the Lord. He has shown forth righteousness. He has declared the Lord his faithfulness and his salvation before others. So picking up in verse 11, we have a bit of a gear shift that we noted earlier, shifting from a song of praise into something of a complaint. And you might note in verse 10 also, 2 Corinthians 4:13 is a similar New Testament thought, speaking forth and not hiding such things. But he continues on, Withhold not thy tender mercies from me, O Lord. Let thy loving kindness and thy truth continually preserve me. So why does he feel the need for preservation and mercy? For innumerable evils have compassed me about. Mine iniquities have taken hold upon me, so that I'm not able to look up. They are more than the hairs of my head, therefore my heart faileth me. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. And again, beginning in verse 13, this is where it's Psalm 70, right? So again, if you go over to Psalm 70, you'll see from here on, it's the same. It says, Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let them be, and here, verses 14 and 15, a little bit of that imprecatory touch that we noted at the beginning. Let them be ashamed and confounded together that seek after my soul to destroy it. Let them be driven backward and put to shame that wish me evil. Again, a bit of insight into the occasion for this particular psalm. There's some trouble afoot. Let them be desolate for a reward of their shame that say unto me, Aha, aha. Right. So those who think they have the upper hand, who are mocking him, ridiculing him, they think they've won. Let all those that seek thee rejoice and be glad in thee. Let such as love thy salvation say continually, The Lord be magnified. So, desolation, shame, confoundedness for the wicked, for his enemies, those who were seeking after his soul to destroy it. But on the other hand, gladness, love, salvation for those that seek after the Lord. And then he concludes with this final thought, But I am poor and needy, yet the Lord thinketh upon me. Right, this is true, right? No matter what your circumstance in this world, if you were faithful, if you seek after the Lord is thinking upon you just as he was upon David. Thou art my help and my deliverer. Make no tarrying, O my God. Which circles back to verse 13. Make haste to help me. Okay. So, let's back up just a bit to verses 6 through 8. So this comes from Hebrews chapter 10. Or rather, it doesn't come from Hebrews chapter 10. There's a reference to it in Hebrews chapter 10. So we'll turn over there for just a moment. Now, Hebrews 10, of course, I refer to it all the time because here in Hebrews 10 you find Paul in his letters talks a lot about the old covenant versus the new, the flesh versus the spirit, but he rarely gets into the details of why. He tends to just kind of state it as a fact and move on. So I've said before, I think I mentioned this back when we went through Galatians in our Bible class. From my point of view, others may disagree, but I'm of the opinion that Romans and Galatians go hand in hand. I sometimes think of Galatians as Romans light because it's the same topic, the same ideas, oftentimes the very same examples and illustrations and verbiage are used, but it's shorter, it's more to the point, it's more easily digestible if you're trying to follow his train of thought. But or I guess I should say Romans 1 through 8 in particular, because later on in that epistle he kind of shifts gears and gets into some different topics, but that portion of Romans, Galatians go hand in hand. Same topic, same idea, same examples. But Hebrews, I think, almost serves as a bit of an appendix to the two, because that's dealing with the same topic as well. Why is it that one only needs the New Testament of Christ as opposed to the old law of Moses, which was nailed to the cross, as it's put in Colossians? Why? And Hebrews goes into more detail answering why that is the case. Not merely that it's the case, but it really gets it. And nowhere, in my estimation, more than in Hebrews 10. In fact, Hebrews 10:4 hits the nail directly on the head. Right? If you only had one verse, one sentence to answer that question, why, Paul, is it that I only need the New Testament of Christ, not the old law of Moses? Because the blood of bulls and goats should not take away sins. It is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. But anyway, a bit further down, here in Hebrews 10, the point of the chapter is we have a new covenant. Well, not just this chapter, chapters 8 through 10, the whole book, but more specifically 8 through 10. Christ is the mediator of a new and better covenant, a new and better testament. The old one served its purpose, that purpose being to ultimately lead mankind to Christ. But now the Old Testament has served its purpose and it is done. We no longer live under it. Now we have the New Testament under Christ. That's the overarching context here. So here in 10, beginning in verse 6, in burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast had no pleasure. Or backing up just a bit, verse 5. He says, wherefore, when he cometh into the world, speaking about Christ, he saith, sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body thou hast prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast had no pleasure. Then said I, lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God. Above, when he said, sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offering for sin thou wouldest not, neither hast any pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first that he may establish the second. Okay, so this is a direct quotation from Psalm 40, verses 6 and 7, specifically used in a messianic sense, referring to Christ. So, these instances in the New Testament, when you have these Old Testament passages with messianic import, are sometimes tricky. Sometimes it's crystal clear that it's a messianic prophecy, other times it isn't. And oftentimes it's the case that when you go back and you find the Old Testament passage, you have a particular phrase or a particular thought that's getting reapplied in the New Testament with respect to Christ. So a good example is Hosea 11, right? In the New Testament, when Herod sets about slaughtering the young infants, the children 2 and under, Joseph takes his family, including the young Jesus, to Egypt to escape this. They ultimately come back, and there's an allusion to Hosea. that God's Son has come out of Egypt, and it's referred to in a prophetic sense. Well, it doesn't take too much. If you go back to Hosea, clearly in Hosea, it's a reference to God delivering the Israelites out of Egypt. It's crystal clear. It isn't given in Hosea in a prophetic sense at all. But then in the New Testament, you have this thought taken and, I suppose, recontextualized as a messianic prophecy. So here, the challenge is, if you say this was intended to be messianic all along, it's the same problem that you have with quotation marks. Where does that begin and end? And the big stumbling block is verse 12, right? And he talks about his iniquities taking hold on him so that he's unable to look up more than the hairs of his head. Therefore his heart fails, the psalmists. So I suppose there are three ways to look at this. One is to say that the entire psalm is from the psalmist's perspective, right? So David's. David is in a bad situation. He's been faithful, yet he recognizes that he's had problems, his iniquities, his sin. But despite this, he's faithful, and he's calling out for the Lord to help him. That's one possibility. Another possibility, 2 of 3, is that the entire psalm is intended to be a messianic reference, right? So even though he's saying I, me, in the first person, really this is all, the entire psalm is about Christ, right? Who's going to come some 900 odd years later. Again, there's a bit of problem with that, with verse 12. The third possibility is it's both. So it starts out David, somewhere, likely around verse 6, it kind of shifts into a messianic, first person looking forward 900 years. And then somewhere along the way, it shifts back to David, either at verse 12 or before it. And that, I don't know that makes a great deal of sense to me personally. I'm personally inclined to think that originally, as it's written, Psalm 40 is this is the psalmist's perspective. Later on in Hebrews 10, similar to what we find in Hosea 11, you have a particular passage here that gets the verbiage, the idea gets taken, and part of the reason I'm pretty confident saying that is in Hebrews he says, when he comes into the world, he says, and then quotes from this. So you have Christ quoting from Psalm 40, although I don't know that it was originally intended to necessarily be a messianic prophecy, and I would say much in the same sense that Hebrews or Hosea 11 is. So, as I've used before, we have the Tanakh, the Jewish Publication Society, right? A Hebrew Bible, as it were, and it translates it a bit differently, and perhaps sheds a bit of light on this. So verses 7 and 8 read there. You gave me to understand that you do not desire sacrifice and meal offering. You do not ask for burnt offering and purification offering. Then I said, see, I will bring a scroll recounting what befell me. To do what pleases you, my God, is my desire. Your teaching is in my inmost parts. So there, and it certainly fits with the King James or any other more modern version that we know as well. The idea there seeming to be that he's going to bring forth his record, as it were, whether it's a literal book, a literal writing, or it's used in a metaphorical sense. The idea there is what God really wants is a faithful person. He's been that, so he says, "Then said I, lo, I come. In the volume of the book it's written of me." Right? In other words, I'm coming forward. And I'm bringing the record of my life, right? I'm going to lay it all bare. Here's what the proverbial book says about me. What have I done? I delight to do thy will, O Lord my God. Thy laws are within my heart. I've preached righteousness in the great congregation. I've not refrained my lips, thou knowest. I've not hid thy righteousness within my heart. I've declared thy faithfulness and thy salvation. Right? I've done all of these things. I've been a faithful person. You know, my life's record says so. You know, there's nothing to be hid. It's written of me. So that's the distinct impression that I get from Psalm 40. Again, Hebrews 10, Christ takes the very same verbiage from this psalm and uses it in the sense of the burnt offerings. In other words, the animal sacrifices of the Old Testament were not pleasing to God. In what sense? That they couldn't fix the sin problem. His sacrifice could, and that's what the rest of Hebrews 10 goes on to say. It goes on to talk about the fact that Christ's sacrifice was able to do what those animal sacrifices under the old law couldn't, and that is actually fix the sin problem in a real way, or in a final way, not in a prospective sense. So that is Psalm 40 in a nutshell. Lord willing, we will pick back up next week. We will continue on with Psalm 41. Thank you all very much for your kind attention today.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord. 'Cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? You are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me